Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all having an incredible day today. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the Kimberley killer, and this is like a real life version of Wolf Creek. Before we get into it, I just want to thank today's sponsor, Casetify. You guys know I'm obsessed with Casetify, and I just got a ton of new cases and I'm so excited! Okay, so I got this green and black check case, which is to die for. I got this zebra case, which I think is my absolute favorite because I'm obsessed with zebra print. I think it goes with everything. I have a little zebra print bag. I wear it to death, so I'm so excited about this. This case is literally the cutest thing I've seen in my entire life. And I also got this plain blue case because I love me a plain color block case. This case is actually customizable as well. You can get your initials on it, you can get somebody else's initials on it as a gift, you can get a ton of different colors. There are so many different cases that they have, so many different designs that there's truly something for everybody. And on top of being really cute, they also are super protective, unlike a lot of other protective phone cases which are like really big and clunky and ugly. They're approved for drops of up to 6.6 feet for the impact cases and up to 9 feet for their ultra impact cases, which is amazing if you're clumsy and drop everything like me. The impact and ultra impact cases are also made of 50% recycled material, and all of the cases also have antimicrobial coating which kills 99% of bacteria, so it's all amazing. If you guys are interested in checking any of the cases out, or if you're in need of a new case, you can get a cheeky little 15% off if you go to casetify.com/Bella. I will leave all of the information for that in the description box. And speaking of cases, let's go ahead and get into today's Mystery Monday case. So the murders took place in the top end in the Northern Territory and the Kimberley region in Western Australia. So the areas these murders took place in is really what you picture when you think of Wolf Creek, the Aussie outback, like that one episode of The Simpsons where Bart calls a kid in Australia to ask him which way the toilet flushes, because our toilets flush clockwise, whereas in the Northern Hemisphere they flush anti-clockwise. So he calls this kid in Australia, this kid's toilet flushes clockwise. He's like, can you go and check your neighbours to see if theirs flushes clockwise as well? And it takes this kid 6 hours to get to his neighbour's house and back, because of course Australia is all outback. We all live 3 hours away from our neighbours, and we ride kangaroos to get to them too. But yeah, it's a very harsh environment. It's very remote. The Kimberley region, for example, is the northernmost region of Western Australia, and it covers the entire northwest corner of Australia. That region alone is 163,000 square meters. It's 3 times the size of England, yet there are only 3 towns in that entire area that have a population of more than 2,000 people. Because it is so remote, tourists and anyone traveling through that area are advised to bring water, food, and fuel provisions for at least a few days. And they're also advised not to drive alone at night or at dawn, and only to stick to like the main roads, and there's hardly any phone reception at all. My dad and I drove from Perth to Exmouth, which is obviously not nearly as remote as the Kimberley, and even for that 13-hour drive, it was like super desolate. In that entire 13 hours, we saw maybe 10 to 15 other cars, and we were driving for maybe like 45 minutes after the sunset, and we were like kind of shitting bricks, to be honest with you. One, because we had been talking about all of the outback murders that had happened in Australia and just like freaking ourselves out, but also because at that time, the animals are crazy. Kangaroos will literally just come and jump in front of your car, and if a kangaroo jumps in front of your car, like what do? There's no reception. If you can't drive anywhere, you're just stranded there. You just have to hope somebody else drives past, or you have to hope there's a town nearby that you can walk to. Luckily, we caught up to a road train and we just drove behind that until we got to the place that we were going to stay. But now that you have a bit of an idea about the places that these murders took place, let's go ahead and talk about what happened. In early June of 1987, 70-year-old Marcus Bullen, a former deputy mayor of Fremantle, and his wife Winifred were on a driving holiday in the Northern Territory's top end with their 40-year-old son Lance Bullen and his wife Joan. They'd been on their road trip for a few weeks by this point, and they were about to start slowly making their way on the 3,500 kilometre drive back home to Western Australia. On the afternoon of the 8th of June, they arrived in the town of Timber Creek, and they stopped in and camped for the night at the Wayside Inn and Caravan Park, where they could use, proper showers, flushable toilets, do some laundry, which they hadn't been able to do at the makeshift campsites that they'd been staying in. Over the next few days, they planned to continue southwest toward Western Australia and into the Kimberley region, but they wanted to do some fishing while they were in Timber Creek because that part of the Victoria River was really well known for its barramundi. It was also really well known for being infested with crocodiles, but that's neither here nor there. So the next morning, the morning of the 9th of June, Marcus and Lance set off in the family's station wagon to go and find a good fishing spot and a spot where they could set up Schwab camp for the night near the river. Between the four of them, Marcus, Lance, Winifred, and Joan, they only had one car, so the men told the women that they'd be back in about an hour or so to come and get them. However, hours and hours passed and they didn't come back. Joan and Winifred got pretty worried because, I mean, there's so many things that could have happened. You know, they could have gotten lost, they could have gotten injured, the car could have broken down, they had no reception to contact anybody, they could have been taken by a crocodile, they could have just stopped for a fish and lost track of time, but you just never know. And to top it all off, Joan and Winifred had no idea where they'd gone because they'd gone to find a spot. Like, Marcus and Lance didn't even know where they were going when they left. So by that afternoon, Joan and Winifred contacted the Timber Creek police station to report their husbands missing. There were two officers on duty that afternoon, Constable First Class Martin Plum and Constable Brett Thorpe. They started out by searching all of the popular fishing spots, and they searched until it got dark, but at nighttime there wasn't a lot they could do in the area, so the search was suspended until the next day. Northern Territory Police asked anybody in the area to keep an eye out for any sketchy people, any sketchy cars.
The senseless murders continue to head the news across the top end. Police issue urgent bulletins for people to be on the lookout for suspicious vehicles traversing the area.
The owner of the Wayside Inn and Caravan Park, Helen Anderson, actually heard this and called the police, and she said that she'd recently received a call asking her to keep an eye out for a Toyota 4Runner that had been stolen. And then on the night that Marcus and Lance went missing, she'd actually seen a white Toyota 4Runner parked at the inn. It had Queensland number plates, which didn't match the stolen vehicle she was asked to keep an eye out for, but she told police anyway. Other than that, no one else had seen anything suspicious. The search resumed at first light, and within a few hours they found the Bullen's burnt out Sigma station wagon just 9 kilometers away from their inn. It was adjacent to the Victoria River at the high water line in Riverbed Sand, and down near the edge of the river, police came across 2 shallow graves containing the bodies of Marcus and Lance Bullen. The area was immediately sealed off, it was declared a major crime scene, and the Darwin police were contacted for assistance. Around 1:15 p.m. that day, a team of 7 investigators and forensic pathologists departed Darwin in a police aircraft to Fitzroy Station, as Darwin was around 600 kilometers away from where the crime took place, so they had to fly in. They arrived by around 3:30 p.m. the same day, and for the next 2 days until the 12th of June, a thorough search of the area was conducted. Line searches were conducted in the area the bodies were found, and they found vehicle tracks, shoe impressions, and drag marks that did not belong to the Bullens. A spent cartridge case from a .223 rifle was discovered adjacent to the drag marks on the riverbank, which police believe fell out of the killer's pocket as he was dragging the body. Small blood stains were found on each side of the tire tracks the Bullen's car had made. The drag marks also started from 2 large blood pool stains which were found on the ground next to where the Bullen's car was originally parked before the killer moved it to burn it. The blood stains were confirmed through blood group testing to have been the blood of Marcus and Lance Bullen. It was determined through both forensic analysis and the autopsies that Marcus and Lance Bullen were shot while lying face down on the ground next to their cars. The bullet passed through them and embedded into the ground below. It was also determined that the killer was likely already in the area when Marcus and Lance arrived, or that they arrived shortly after. The killer sat and watched them for a time until they exited their car. He then proceeded to challenge them with a .223 rifle, ordered them to lie face down on the ground, and shot them in the back. The killer then stripped them of their clothes, searched the area for any evidence that might make identifying the men easy. He took the number plates off their car and placed all of this inside their car. The killer then dragged Marcus and Lance's bodies down to the shallow graves where their bodies were later found at the high watermark in Riverbed Sand. The attacker then drove their car a short distance away and set it on fire. While the forensic examination was still taking place, Northern Territory Police set up roadblocks on all major roads throughout the top end, stretching across the entire state and as far south as Alice Springs, in an effort to try and identify the suspect and restrict their movements. And this was a difficult task too, because the area they were operating in was huge. It was the size of France, Spain, and Italy combined. 226 kilometers away from Timber Creek, where Marcus and Lance were murdered, was Kununurra, which is located in the far eastern side of the Kimberley, just 45 kilometers from the Northern Territory border. On the 13th of June, 25-year-old Julie Warren, her 26-year-old fiancé Philip Walkermeyer, and their friend 36-year-old Terry Bolt left Kununurra in Philip's Toyota troop carrier for a weekend away, camping and fishing at the Pentecost River, which was about 110 kilometers away from Kununurra. Julie and Philip were actually going to have their wedding in just a few weeks, so they wanted to have a weekend away with friends to just unwind amidst all of the wedding preparations. So they set up camp at the Pentecost River crossing picnic area, which was about 350 kilometers from the previous murders in Timber Creek. Their other two friends, David Mackenzie, who worked with Philip and Terry at the Department of Aviation in Kununurra, and Daniel Rowe, showed up a little bit later in a separate car. The group spent most of the day and night fishing until about midnight when they all went to bed. The next morning, they all had breakfast together before Daniel and David packed up and went home early. Philip, Terry, and Julie stayed for a little bit longer and continued to do some fishing. The Pentecost River crossing is a popular camping spot, so there were a few other campers in the area. Two of those campers were Desmond Murphy and Branko Mikovic. They left the campsite at around 11:15 a.m. and they said that when they left, there was only one other group that was still there, and that was Philip, Terry, and Julie. They said that Philip and Terry were sitting by some folding chairs near the car, while Julie packed up their bedrolls and was getting ready to leave. They said that their small dinghy with an outboard engine attached was still in the water moored to the riverbank. As they drove out of the campsite, they also noticed a white Toyota four-wheel drive with a canopy on the back parked in a dry creek bed not far from where the campers were. The vehicle was partially obscured, and Desmond did get a quick look at the number plate, not enough to make out like the numbers and the letters, but just long enough to know that it was a Queensland number plate. And he said he didn't see anybody around or near the car. Shortly before 4 p.m. that afternoon, Frederick Pierce Young, who was a truck driver driving his road train from Mount Barnett to Wyndham along the Gibb River Road, which is one of the only two main roads that runs through the entire Kimberley area, he saw thick black smoke coming from the area near the Pentecost River crossing picnic area. As he got closer, the smoke got more and more hectic, and he later told police that because of the color, he thought it may have been a fuel fire, which was definitely an odd thing to be seeing in that area. As he kept driving and past the Pentecost River crossing, he said there were no other cars behind him, but then when he passed the turn off for the picnic area, he noticed a white Toyota 4Runner with a big canopy on the back behind him. He definitely thought it was a little bit odd, so he decided to slow down, move over to the left, and let that car pass him. As the car passed, he noticed that it had Queensland number plates. He didn't manage to get a good look at the guy driving the car, but just said that it was a man with a relatively small build. He also noted that there seemed to be an unusually large amount of camping gear in the canopy for just one person. The next morning, back in Kununurra, David Mackenzie had shown up for work at the Department of Aviation, only to find that Philip and Terry hadn't shown up that day. He was a little bit concerned and hadn't heard from them, so he called up to their houses and didn't get an answer at either. He then contacted Julie's workplace and was told that she also hadn't shown up for work that day. It was super out of the ordinary for any of them not to show up at work, but especially all three of them who had gone camping like 110 kilometers away not to show up for work, so he thought maybe their car had broken down, that they'd gotten stranded at the campsite or somewhere along the road on their way back. He went with another work colleague to check out their houses first, and after finding no sign of them there, he went down to the Pentecost River crossing picnic area, and that is where he found Philip's burnt out Toyota troop carrier in the bush near where they'd camped. They also found Philip's dinghy on the opposite side of the riverbank. The engine was missing despite it being attached to the dinghy the day before when he was there, but there was no sign of Julie, Philip, or Terry. Immediately he contacted the Wyndham police, which were over an hour away. When they arrived at the scene, obviously they conducted a search of the area. They found that the outboard engine from the dinghy, along with some other camping equipment and a gas bottle, was in the back of the burnt out car. There were several spots of blood on the ground, boot prints, tire impressions, and 5 spent cartridges from a .223 caliber gun. They continued the search, and at around 4:15 p.m. they found the naked body of Julie Warren lying face down on the edge of the river, about 500 meters away from where they were camping, toward the river crossing. A small wound was evident on her right shoulder, consistent with that that of a bullet wound. Now, Western Australian police had heard of the murders of Marcus and Lance Bullen 5 days earlier because it was big news. I think almost everybody in Australia had probably heard of it. So police immediately started connecting the dots, seeing the similarities between the two crime scenes, and they theorized that the murders were likely connected and committed by the same offender or offenders. They called in reinforcements from Perth, which was 3,000 kilometers away, and got to work setting up roadblocks all throughout the Kimberley, as far south as Pilbara region and as far east as the Victoria River, where the roadblocks set up by the Northern Territory Police in relation to the Bullen murders were still in place. The next morning at 7:45 a.m. on the 16th of June, Philip Walkermeyer's naked body was found floating face down in the river near the campsite. Like Julie, he had been shot. He had extensive head injuries and had 2 bullet wounds in his back and 1 in his right shoulder. At 9:30 a.m, Terry Bolt's naked body was also found on the south bank of the river around 900 meters away, and he had also been shot. Based on the forensic evidence at the campsite, it was theorized that Philip, Julie, and Terry were watched at their campsite from high ground. The killer then approached them through high grass, and when they were about 100 meters away, they came out and started open firing a Ruger Mini 14 high-powered weapon and kind of moved in an arc around the campsite, which can be seen through the shoe impressions, flattened grass, and spent cartridges. The bodies were then stripped of their clothing and rolled into the Pentecost River. The clothing and camping gear was then loaded into Philip's car. It was driven a short distance away into a gully where it was then set on fire. Police theorized that they were looking for one or more killers who was hunting travelers throughout the top end of the country for sport. And by this point, the Kimberley region basically shut down because people were scared. Locals were scared, tourists were scared, the police were concerned because they knew if they didn't find the killer or killers that they would strike again most likely.
As word spread, people went to caravan parks, hotels, and there was virtually nobody on the roads.
Roadblocks are now in place across the Kimberley. Motorists are stopped by police and warned not to travel into the area.
Lovely, quiet place that has been out here, and then for something like this, it affects everybody, puts a bad taste in your mouth.
The 5 murders had made national news by this point. Probably everybody in Australia had heard of them, and the media dubbed the killer the Kimberley Killer, despite 2 of the murders taking place in the Northern Territory. Tourists were strongly advised to reconsider their travel, and anybody who was camping or lived in a house quite far away from a community was going to a caravan park. They were going to communities to gather for safety. Even people in the massive, like million-hectare cattle stations left their stations and went into the closest town. Police were doing everything they could to find the killer, but they had hundreds of thousands of kilometers to search and no idea who they were looking for, where they might have gone. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. On the 16th of June, 7 officers from the Western Australian Tactical Response Group, which is like a specialist team that responds to high-risk situations, were flown in from Perth to Kununurra to assist in the investigation. Detectives from the Major Crime Squad were also flown in to assist, and they spent the next 5 days searching everywhere they could think to look. They got police aircrafts in the air looking for any dust trails that a car would make when driving on gravel or dirt roads, and then they would go and, question these cars and ambush these cars to stop, to go and question them about what they were doing. Meanwhile, police utilized the media attention, warning people of what was going on and also asking people to report any suspicious activity. There were a few witnesses who called up to tell police about a suspicious white Toyota 4Runner with Queensland number plates. This is also when Frederick Pierce Young actually called the police to let them know about the smoke that he had seen. And so police really honed in on this lead. They started looking for all registration information for all Toyota 4Runners in the area. They made nationwide appeals for any information on stolen or missing Toyota 4Runners, and that's when they got a call informing them that a German tourist named Joseph Schwab had rented a white Toyota 4Runner from Avis at Brisbane Airport and had not returned it despite it being significantly overdue. So police began circulating a description of Joseph Schwab and his rental car nationwide. By this point, forensic evidence had determined that the boot prints found where the Bullens were murdered in Timber Creek were actually a match to the boot prints found in the Pentecost River scene, confirming that the murders were committed by the same person. Roadblocks along the Kimberley region and the Northern Territory were still in place, but now South Australian police had also set up roadblocks in the south along the Stewart Highway. In order to get from Timber Creek to the Pentecost River, you had to pass through Kununurra, and then the next main town on from the Pentecost River was Fitzroy Crossing. So that's where police believed the killer was headed. And to add to the fear that the killer was going to strike again, the annual Fitzroy Crossing rodeo was due to start in just over a week, and the rodeo was one of the most significant annual events in the region, which meant thousands of people would be in town. And with all of the tourists in town, not only would the killer have a lot of potential targets, but it would be a lot easier for them to slip away with the crowds. News that police were looking for a white Toyota 4Runner was passed on to the media, and soon everybody in the region was keeping an eye out. Helicopter pilot Peter Leutenegger was one of those people. Early in the morning of the 19th of June, he was up in his helicopter mustering his horses from the air when he saw a camouflaged vehicle in a closed-off paddock in the Jubilee Downs area. Jubilee Downs was a remote town, and the car wasn't in a place that someone would typically camp, so he made a low-level pass over the vehicle to get a closer look, but even from a low altitude, he couldn't make out the make or model of the car because it was so camouflaged. But he realized it could have been the Toyota 4Runner, so immediately he flew straight to Fitzroy Crossing and landed his helicopter in front of the Fitzroy Crossing police station, which sounds like something out of a movie. Doesn't it sound epic? Anyway, the TRG was alerted and they were flown into Fitzroy Crossing, and Peter took 2 TRG members up in his helicopter to show them the car, and even they couldn't make out the make or model because it was so camouflaged. It was really sketchy how camouflaged it was. So they flew back into Fitzroy Crossing, and immediately they organized for the airspace around Fitzroy Crossing to be cut off to all civilian traffic. At midday that day, the TRG officers drove out to a road close to where the camouflage vehicle was parked and walked toward their target carrying all of their weapons and equipment. At the same time, a small police aircraft flew low over the camouflage vehicle to try and flush out anyone inside or nearby in the bush. The pilots also directed the TRG officers who were on foot, as the bushland was so dense that they couldn't see anything in front of them, they couldn't see what was going on, they couldn't even see the camouflaged car. And as they approached, they suddenly heard high-powered rifle fire. I listened to the Australian True Crime podcast where they interviewed Bob Brown, who was one of the TRG officers on the ground, and it's just so crazy to hear it from his perspective, because what a crazy situation to be in, what a crazy and terrifying situation to have to put yourself in. This crazy gunman, he's just firing, you can't see him firing, and you have to go in there and put yourself on the line. I definitely recommend going and giving that episode a listen if you're interested in hearing about this shootout from the perspective of somebody who is actually there. It was really interesting, and I will leave the link in the description down below. So Bob said that they had kind of a quick debrief when this happened, and then they all kind of just made peace that going into this, it really could be the end of the line. It was a very dangerous situation. He said as soon as they heard those shots, they knew they were walking into trouble, but as it turns out later, the gunman was actually firing at the pilot overhead. As the TRG moved forward and got within eyesight of the vehicle and the gunman, they had to hide behind ant hills and trees. The gunman was just 40 meters in front of them, and they noticed he was naked from the waist up. He had camouflage trousers on, and he was standing at the front of his car. Just as they got within eyesight, the pilot overhead who was guiding them actually had to fly away to check its airworthiness because the pilot believed that they had been shot. Luckily, they hadn't been shot. It was just that the noise from the bullets was so loud that it sounded like they had been shot. But for the time being, the TRG team were on their own, and just as they were taking cover, the gunman spotted one of the officers and turned to face them. The officer in command called on him to stop firing, announced that they were police, and told him to surrender. In response, the gunman started shooting at the TRG officers, and it became clear that he was a good shot and well trained. He actually almost shot one of the TRG officers at this point, with the bullet just grazing his arm. Bob Brown was the closest gunman, and so he shot at him, blasting the stock of his rifle and taking off the gunman's thumb. The gunman ran back to his car and emerged with a Ruger Mini 14, which is a firearm that can easily be handled with one hand.
You've got bullets flying past you, you don't know whether to put your head left, right, or duck up or lay down, because you don't know where you're going to put your head.
The gunman then continued shooting at the TRG officers while retreating in a westerly direction. In return, the TRG officers returned fire and also began throwing tear gas grenades toward his vehicle. As it was the dry season, these grenades actually set fire to the scrub, which reduced visibility for everybody involved. Due to the fire, the gunman began to retreat into the bushes, and he was using a military tactic where you would shoot, retreat into a new position, shoot again, retreat into a new position, retreating until eventually they can escape. But the TRG officers knew that even though they couldn't see him, they had to keep up the momentum, they had to keep returning fire, they had to keep moving forward so that he didn't have the opportunity to escape. They weren't sure if there were any hostages in the car, and they also knew that they needed to preserve the car for any evidence, so Bob Brown, while under covering fire from his colleagues, ran to the vehicle, jumped in from the passenger side, slid across to the driver's seat, and luckily the keys were in the ignition, so he managed to drive the car out of the fire. As Bob got out of the car, the heat from the scrub fire actually caused a bunch of ammunition that the gunman had left on the floor around the area of his vehicle to start exploding, causing the TRG officers to dive for cover. Soon after, the police aircraft managed to return and told the TRG officers that he could see the offender lying face down in the dirt about 20 meters in front of them. So at 1:15 p.m, the TRG officers stood up and walked forward and found the gunman lying face down in the ground with his rifle sticking up in the dirt next to him. It was kind of like he fell down while holding his rifle, and it just kind of like in the dirt. He had a gunshot wound through his back which exited through his heart, and he was likely dead before he even hit the ground. With the gunman dead, the TRG officers secured the crime scene, destroyed the fire, and waited for investigators and crime scene experts to arrive. At the scene, police located a bunch of .223 caliber shell casings, which were later confirmed to have been from the same weapon that killed all 5 victims, the Ruger 14 Mini self-loading rifle. They found that the heavy camouflage vehicle was a white Toyota 4Runner with Queensland plates, the same one rented from Avis at Brisbane Airport by Joseph Schwab and hadn't been returned. Inside the car, they found a bunch of items that definitively linked him to both the Timber Creek and Pentecost River murders. They found the gunman's shoes, which were Timberline brand boots. They had a distinctive ripple pattern sole, and these were later forensically matched to the boot prints located at both murder scenes. Also inside the car, they found a firearms license, driver's license, credit cards, a saving account book, checking books, and camping equipment, all of which belonged to the 5 victims. They also found a passport that belonged to Joseph Schwab. They found fishing tackle, a toolbox, and 10 sets of water buffalo horns, which will become important later. And on top of all of this, the tire impressions taken from the Toyota 4Runner matched the impressions left near both of the murder scenes. On my birthday, actually, on the 21st of June, Joseph Schwab's body was transported to Derby Regional Hospital, where a post-mortem exam was conducted, and he was formally identified as Joseph Schwab. Joseph Schwab was born on the 25th of November in 1960 in the Bavarian district of Starnberg, and not a lot is actually known about his childhood aside from the fact that from a young age he had this obsession with guns. When he was 15 years old, he joined a local German firearms club, a club that he stayed a member of well into adulthood, and by 16 he started carrying a pistol with him. Schwab was known as a quiet loner who had very few friends. In 1980, he got involved with a criminal gang in West Germany and was arrested and charged for motor vehicle theft, stealing from a restaurant, and a break-and-enter offense. The next year, in June of 1981, when he was 21 years old, he decided to get a fresh start here in Australia. He arrived in Adelaide on the 15th of June, got a job as a cabinet maker, and rented a place on Seaview Road in Henley Beach. And while he was here, he joined the Southern Cross Pistol Club, bought several rifles, and in his free time, he took trips in his Land Cruiser and went in the bush to hunt wild pigs. Eventually, in May of 1984, after losing his job, he did return to Germany. In April the next year, he got a job as a security guard in his hometown, which required him to get formal pistol training, which would explain why he was a good shot and seemed like he had some training in the shootout with the TRG officers. In West Germany at the time, criminal convictions for less serious offenses were actually expunged from a person's record after a 5-year crime-free period, which means he didn't have any criminal history, which meant that he could work as a security guard with a pistol. And he worked there until April of 1987 before deciding to return to Australia. On the 18th of March in 1987, he went and bought $5,400 worth of traveller's checks, and then less than a month later, he went and boarded a flight from Frankfurt to Brisbane and landed here in Brisbane on the 18th of April. On the 21st of April, he went into the city, into an ANZ, and told them he lost his traveller checks and was given $1,000. The next day, on the 22nd, he went and rented the white Toyota 4Runner from Avis at Brisbane Airport. And then on the 23rd, he went to some banks, cashed $4,000 worth of the supposedly lost traveller's checks at one bank, and then the remaining $1,400 at another. Later that day, he went into the Five Ways firearm store in Wollongabba and he put down a deposit for a bunch of guns. He bought a Ruger Mini 14 .223 caliber rifle, a Sarco bolt action 308, a bolt action 22, and a 12 gauge pump action shotgun. And he also purchased about 3,000 cartridges of ammunition, came back the next day, paid the balance of the money he owed, and picked up his guns. The crazy thing is, back then, Queensland had almost no gun laws. You didn't need a background check or anything in order to buy guns, and there was no limit on how much ammunition you could buy. And after this particular case, the coroner on the case pushed for harsher gun laws, for a revision in the legislation limiting the availability of guns. But it wouldn't be until the Port Arthur massacre in 1996 that Australia would reform its gun laws. Anyway, police were able to piece together bits and pieces of Schwab's movements after this. On the 6th of May, he got petrol from a fuel station in a remote area of Brisbane that borders both the South Australian and the Northern Territory borders. 2 days later, he was in Mount Isa, which they knew because he had received a parking ticket there. By May 20th, he had travelled over 3,500 kilometres from Brisbane to Winnelly in the Northern Territory. There, he had the front end of the 4Runner repaired, and the next day, he sent his parents a postcard. After this, his whereabouts were unknown until the 4th of June when his 4Runner was spotted at a game park in Carmel Plains. Here is where he shot a large number of water buffalo and removed their horns, which the horns were found in his car after the shootout, if you remember me mentioning that. After this, he continued through the Northern Territory, driving southwest to Timber Creek and the Victoria River, where he set up camp, camouflaged himself, and murdered Marcus and Lance Bullen. He then made his way to the Pentecost River in the Kimberley, where he set up camp, camouflaged himself, and murdered Julie Warren, Philip Walkermeyer, and Terry Bolt. A coronial inquest into the murders was held by coroner David McCann in December of 1987, and it was found that the murder of Joseph Schwab was justifiable because he was shooting at police to avoid arrest, and they were returning fire in self-defense. The motivation behind these crimes, however, could not be determined. Schwab was not suffering from any medical problems. He didn't have a history of any mental health issues. His parents found it almost impossible that he could be responsible for such cold-blooded killings. It is assumed, however, that these killings were premeditated. He gave Avis a false name and address when renting his car, and he also lied to ANZ about losing his traveller's checks. Stripping his victims and burning their belongings was theorized to have been done out of anger rather than in an attempt to destroy evidence. Some theorize robbery was the true motive because a lot of the victims' belongings were found in his car after the shootout, but we'll never know the true reason. And that is everything for this case. I would love to hear your opinions on this case, why you think he did it. What are your theories about why he did it? I would be really interested to know what can trigger a person to just send them on such a cold-blooded killing spree, killing innocent people who they don't even know. But I would love to hear your opinions and theories in the comments down below, have a chat about them. I hope you guys have an incredible rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye guys!